Welcome, everyone, to our webinar series on participation and representation in the digital age. My name is Jenny Oser, and I'm a professor of politics and government at Ben-Gurion University. I'm also the principal investigator of an ERC project on this topic, and I'm honored to introduce our speaker today, Professor Yotam Margalit, who's a professor of political science at Tel Aviv University. Yotam is a leading scholar on the topic of globalization, and he is also a senior fellow in the Israel Democracy Institute's Economic Reforms Program. Today, he'll present a co-authored article about the political consequences of green policies, which was published in the American Political Science Review in 2024. To make the most of our time, here's how we'll run this webinar. First, Yotam will speak for about 35 minutes. Second, I'll introduce our course panelists who've prepared questions in advance about the article. And third, we'll select questions that participants write to us in the chat for Q&A. So during the talk, we welcome you. Send your questions in the chat to any of us who are defined as co-hosts for the panelists' review. A final technical note that I'll also drop in the chat. For anyone interested in seeing a written transcript of the webinar, we've enabled this feature that you can activate by clicking on your Zoom screen's bottom right More option and then clicking Transcript. Thank you for joining us. And Yotam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jenny. I'll just start with uploading the presentation. All right. Can you see the screen? Everything looks okay?
Looks great.
So first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to see that you have this series now running in Ben-Gurion University. And thanks for inviting me to take part. Too bad it's remotely, but nice nonetheless. So I'll be presenting today a paper on a topic that I've become increasingly preoccupied with, namely the environmental politics and political challenge of dealing with climate change. The work that I'll be presenting today is co-authored with Italo Colantone and Livio di Lonardo and Marco Percoco, all from Bocconi University. The reasons, I think, for being concerned with environmental degradation and with climate change are probably obvious to everyone here. But as I'll explain in a moment, the specific angle that we're looking at on this issue, namely the way that the distributional aspects of green policies affect the electoral response to it, I think that's an angle that is less well understood and one that I think merits serious attention. So I'll start by way of quick motivation. If you recall, the picture here is from a demonstration from the Yellow Vest movement in Paris, which took place or started in October 2018 as a protest against the government's proposed increase of the carbon tax. And the aim there was to bring the locals to drive less or to switch to less polluting cars. That was Macron's government's idea. But the protesters took to the streets and argued that the carbon tax would actually put a disproportionately large burden on middle class and working class households. And here we've got an example from an article that came out in Dissent magazine. It's citing a 33-year-old woman saying that it's all well and good to tell people who are making 1,000 euros a month to change their car, but they can't. Okay, the idea here clearly it's expensive. And so this kind of frustration turned out into national demonstrations. They intensified. Ultimately, President Macron chose to reverse the initial carbon tax and to drop this initiative. And I think that this example from France highlights a bigger issue, and that is namely that while governments in many countries increasingly view environmental protection and combating of climate change as central priorities, advancing these types of policies or policies geared toward achieving these types of goals can actually be very difficult politically. Now, why is that? Here we've got a few reasons on the screen. First of all, because green policies often require a large upfront investment, and that offers benefits only in the distant future. That's something that obviously politicians don't like, things that they require high costs in the short run with the benefits coming only later on. Moreover, these policies often have strong distributional consequences, and those can diminish public support for the policies, and in some cases, they also serve as an easy target for the opposition. And this gives rise to the main research questions that we're interested in this project. First of all, we want to know, does the introduction of green policies actually affect the way people vote? And the second is, to what extent is the political response a function of the policy's distributive implications? And I think that this is not an obvious question, because if you think about it, even if some peoples are, winners or losers from these policies, you could imagine that the losers would say, okay, maybe I'm taking some hint, but this is actually a good thing for the environment, for the planet. And so the fact that being a loser in terms of financial costs translating into votes, I don't think it's an obvious answer, and this is in part what we're looking at. And then there's the question of who benefits from the anti-green backlash and what exactly is driving that. What's the mechanism? And so our contention in this paper is that an anti-green sentiment actually fits very well with right-wing populist agenda. And that is the case in part because green policies are actually becoming more and more synonymous with scientific expertise, with management by technocrats, and with significant influence of multilateral international institutions. And all of these things we're well familiar are obviously targets of populist anger and ire. And so if we look at that, on top of that, environmental policy is often perceived as a kind of elitist concern that places ultimately disproportionate costs on the common people. And I think that for all of these reasons, it's unsurprising that we're seeing more and more right-wing populists actually distinguishing themselves as leaders of this green skeptic movement. And so here I'll just give a couple of examples. This is from Alex Gauland from the AfD, the far-right German party, and he's saying the environmental agenda, the Greta cult, is reminiscent of collective hysteria in the Middle Ages. Another one, this is Tom van Grieken from the Freedom Party, the Geert Wilders party in the Netherlands, saying the climate effects are not clear at all. The elite are laughing while rubbing their hands. They will benefit from these climate action plans, but the hardworking citizens will pay more for their electricity, their car, their heating. So this is something that we're seeing more. Obviously, we're now seeing Trump coming in and yesterday announcing that the US is going to withdraw from the Paris Accords. And so we think that there's real reason to view this as a broader phenomenon. What we're going to be doing in this specific study, we're going to be exploiting an introduction of a green policy in the city of Milan in the form of a major ban on some polluting cars. And we're going to try and use the arbitrary thresholds in the design of the policy to examine whether and how the introduction of this green policy that has very clear uneven costs ultimately affects how people vote and their green attitudes and behavior. Okay? So very briefly, I'll just introduce or sort of preview the main results that we're going to find. First of all, we're going to find a very strong impact of the green policy on increasing support for Lega, that's the populist right-wing party in Italy. We're going to find no corresponding shift in views or behavior on environmental issues, which is ultimately kind of the mechanism. We don't find a corresponding shift in views or behavior on environmental issues. Rather, the change in the electoral choice towards Lega is going to reflect voters' disaffection from the perceived unfairness of the policy and the pocketbook implications. So very briefly, in terms of the outline for the rest of the talk, I'll start with a very brief discussion of the relevant findings in the literature. I'll run through it. We'll then describe some detail in the context that the specific context that we're going to be studying, go through the empirical setup, and then move on to the results. The final part, I'll try and discuss some of the mechanisms for our main findings, okay? Depending on time, I'll try and conclude with some broader thoughts on what I think are where the findings point us towards, and some things that strike me as worth thinking about in the broader context here of this research project. Okay, very briefly on the literature. I'm not going to go into multiple studies in the detail, but just to say, much of the research to date studies the politics of climate change from an international perspective. So basically, the view is that we've got here a problem of coordination between states, a collective action problem, and we need to figure out ways of how to go about it. Recent studies we're seeing more and more looking at the importance of domestic debate surrounding environmental policy and arguing that the focus on international level alone misses important politics that takes place at the domestic level. Notably, most of these studies explore domestic politics or environmental policies. They study the variation in public support for the policy as the outcome to be explained. Okay, that's the dependent variable, not as the explanatory variable. So ultimately, we know very little about the impact of green policies as an independent variable affecting electoral politics. This is where our study comes in and where we wish to make a contribution, namely to provide an insight on whether and how the introduction of green policies with uneven costs affects people's voting behavior. At the time that we published this paper, there was only a single paper that did that, Leah Stokes' paper from 2016. Since we published our paper, I've seen already a couple of additional follow-ups. So I think this is a growing area of interest, and I'll hopefully convince you that it's worthwhile looking at it. Okay, so now let's talk about what the specific case that we're studying in this paper. So we're going to be looking at what's called the Area B policy, which was a policy that was announced by Milan's mayor only in July 2018. The Area B is a restricted traffic area that covers the majority of the city here. And as you'll see in a moment in a map, the very center of the city, it's called Area C, and that's anybody who's been in Milan, that's the area around the Duomo. That part is excluded because that was already subject to various restrictions on traffic already from 6 years earlier. So you can see here, this is the map. You can see the central area here that's in red, that's the Area B. At the very center is the Area C. Area B covers 72% of geographic Milan, but it covers 97% of the population. So basically, we're talking about the area where most of the overwhelming majority of Milan citizens are residing. And what we're talking about here is that Area B is the access to it was prohibited for most polluting cars. In a moment, I'll discuss which ones exactly. But basically, they couldn't drive through the working week. From Monday to Friday, 7:30 to 7:30 p.m. You couldn't come in. First restrictions were implemented late February. And then in 2019, there was a full ban of older cars. Initially, you'll see in a moment 3 types of categories in the diesel cars and 1 category in the petrol cars. And then in October, there's going to be an additional ban on newer cars. Okay, so I'll talk about exactly how it works. But the point to explain here is that what you're going to see here, starting in 1992, every several years, the EU introduced new and increasingly stringent regulations defining the maximum permitted levels of for various pollutants. And all new vehicles that were produced and sold in Europe at any point in time have to comply with the most recent emission standards. Okay, so they have to belong to the current active category. And to date, we've got 7 such categories. It starts at Euro 0, and you see that every several years, it advances all the way up to Euro 6. Okay, so before February 2019, all car models were allowed to drive in Area B of Milan without any restrictions. Okay, then starting in February of that year, in 2018, all diesel cars until this category of Euro 3 were banned, as well as petrol cars, the old ones, from Euro 0. But the main change that now happens is that in October 1st, diesel Euro 4 cars were also covered by the policy, which meant that these relatively new cars, those produced between 2006 and 2010, suddenly were banned from driving throughout most of the city. Okay, those are the cars that you're seeing here. Okay, so we're going to focus our analysis on those 4 types of categories, Euro 4 and Euro 5. Towards the end of it, we're also going to add these Euro 6, but this is going to be the focus of our analysis here. Just to conclude still the description of the program, it's important to emphasize that we're not talking about a toll. It's only access versus no access. If you're not allowed, you're not allowed to go into the city car entrance. So basically, people had to get rid of their cars if they wanted to use it in Milan. Until the end of 2019, affected car owners could apply for funding assistance from the municipality of Milan. Initially, it was only for low-income earners. Later, they expanded it. And what you'd get is a compensation of up to 4,000 euros to purchase a new car, or up to 2,000 euros for a used car. Or you could alternatively receive subsidies to purchase a bike or a public transit subscription. So that was the program here. Okay. Now, when it was announced, it was one of the most salient political issues in Milan. Very quickly became something that was dividing the political arena on left-right dimension. Essentially, it was launched by the mayor of the city, Beppe Sala, who was from the social or sort of the center-left Democratic Party. And it was strongly opposed. The most vocal opposition was Lega, the populist right party. And they argued that this policy is ultimately going to impact or disproportionately negatively impact the low-income drivers. So what they tried to make it is to basically talk about this policy as one of folks sort of pitting rich elites that are advancing this policy versus the common people. I'll show you here just a few examples. This is Attilo Fontana, who's the president of Lombardy, the broader region in which Milan resides. And he says that Area B penalizes the weaker in society. Milan is becoming a city for the rich only. Here's another guy, Massimiliano Bastoni, who's a council member of Lombardy, also from Lega. And he's saying this initiative, talking about the Area B, will create only inconveniences and disasters, depressing the economy, penalizing the weaker social segments. Could you expect anything different from the radical chic left that just claims to be the people's friend, but is actually not? So this is the line that the Lega and the populist right were attacking the policy. Here you can see the mayor, Beppe Sala. My administration, forward-looking, cares about the way Milanese breathe. It's better to do things with wisdom than to search for people's approval every single day. So against this onslaught of criticism from Lega, he tried to argue that this is ultimately the right thing and that the Milanese people would benefit from promoting this policy. Okay, so this is the setup. We talked about the motivation. Now let's talk a little about the empirical approach and how we're going to ultimately try and identify the causal effect of introducing this policy on people's vote and behavior on green issues. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're interested in learning about whether it really had an effect on the way people view politics, on how they voted, on how they behaved on green issues. And for that, we're going to administer a targeted survey in Milan with slightly over 1,000 car owners, okay, at that 1,073. All of those people are people that reside in Area B, but outside of Area C. And we're going to have we're going to have the treatment group and we're going to have the control group. The treatment group are almost 300 respondents that owned a banned diesel Euro 4 car. It's going to be a specific set of cars here that are in this category at the time in which the Area B restrictions were announced. And then the control, namely the people that weren't affected by the policy, are 412 owners of Euro 5 or petrol Euro 4 cars. I'll explain that in a moment. Or it's also going to include 300 owners of newer Euro 6 models. We're going to use them for some placebo tests that I'll explain in a moment. And then I'll just note that there were 65 respondents that didn't remember the details of their car model, but I'll show you that the results are robust to whether we include them or don't, whether we just include them based on their self-reported treatment status. It's not going to really matter for understanding the results. Okay, so as I said, the whole analysis and the first part is going to focus on those four sets of cars. There's Euro 4, whether you have a diesel car or a petrol car, and depending on how new or old this car is. Okay, that's what we're going to be looking at. And think about it, what we've got here on the left-hand side, we've got the status before October 19. And then after October 19, we've got this one set of car categories, these Euro 4 diesel cars. They're going to be the ones that are now going to be banned. And we're going to be looking at them. And so the comparison here is going to exclude the owners of the very old cars, so Euro 3 and before. And for now, we're also going to exclude the very new cars, the Euro 6 category. Okay? And we're going to collect complete information on all family cars. That's going to allow us later to potentially explore treatment effects at the household level. For now, it's not that critical for the analysis I'll be showing. How we're going to be analyzing it? In terms of identification, we're using a difference in differences estimation to assess the impact of the ban. I'm not going to go through all the econometrics here. It's less interesting. I'll just say that basically we're going to have a treatment, a dummy for whether you have a diesel car or not, whether it's a Euro 4 car, which is the category that we're interested, and then ultimately the treatment effect is going to be captured by this delta that is going to capture the interaction between a diesel and a Euro 4 car. That is the one that we're going to care about. And we're going to be looking at different sets of outcomes, whether it's voting, whether it's your preferences on green policy, on green behavior. I'll show you on a set of different outcomes. But what we'll care about is ultimately the coefficient for this interaction effect. Now, ultimately, the treatment effect can be interpreted in two ways: as a difference between fuel categories, or as a difference between emission categories. And I'll show it to you now graphically, because I think that's going to make it simpler here. Okay, so let's start with the first diff and diff, and I'll try and simplify as much as possible kind of the logic behind this analysis. Okay, so here what we're going to be doing in the first diff and diff, the delta is going to capture the difference in the diff and diff of outcomes between diesel versus petrol owners of Euro 4 and diesel versus petrol owners of Euro 5. Now, what's the logic here? Think about it. All the owners of cars that are the Euro 5, they are not going to be affected at all by the policy. So any difference between them, between the diesel and the petrol cars on voting, they're going to ultimately reflect potential differences in orientation by type of fuel. So maybe people that own diesel cars just have different preferences, political preferences, than people have petrol cars, okay? However, for the Euro 4 cars, diesel owners now are going to be treated while the petrol owners are not. So the difference in differences here captures the effect of the policy net, when we net out the potential different orientations between diesel and petrol owners. Okay? Now, the one assumption here is that these different orientations play a constant role across Euro 4 and Euro 5, which I think is a fairly plausible assumption. The second diff and diff here is by fuel categories. Here, the delta is the diff and diff of outcomes between the Euro 4 versus Euro 5 owners of diesel versus the Euro 4 and the Euro 5 owners of petrol. Okay? So let's go through the intuition here. All the petrol owners are unaffected. So the difference between Euro 4 and Euro 5 within petrol should reflect any potential differences in orientation by emission category, basically owners of new cars versus older cars. So maybe people that own newer cars have different environmental preferences, political preferences than ones that have older cars. However, when we look at the diesel cars, owners of the Euro 4 are going to be treated while the owners of the Euro 5 are not. So the diff in diff is going to capture the effect of the policy, again, netting out the potential different orientations between owners of Euro 4 and Euro 5 owners, okay? Car owners. So again, under the assumption that these different orientations are going to play a constant role across diesel and petrol, which again, I think plausible, yes or no, we can discuss, okay? But that is the identification strategy that we're going to be using in this analysis, okay? Turning to the data, I'll start very briefly with some descriptive statistics. Here you can see the characteristics of all the 4 car types, their owners. We're going to look at here the mean characteristics of these 4 groups on age, education, and income. And as you can see here, there are some differences across the groups. But if we look at the diesel Euro 4 car owners, and that's the group that interests us the most here, they're on average slightly more educated, somewhat wealthier, and also underrepresented among the very young and among the older, the 55 and plus age groups. Now notice that all these 3 characteristics, we know already from prior research, they're actually negatively correlated with support for populist parties. So in the analysis that I'm going to show you, it's going to be quite difficult to attribute the shift towards Lega to individual characteristics that are simply correlated with certain car ownership preferences. Okay, and that's, I think, quite important here. Okay. When we look at how much it cost them, how badly were people hurt by the policy? So first of all, we can see that about 23% said that they didn't know to say how much. And we have about just under, so around roughly 9%, just under 10% that said they weren't negatively affected here. Okay, presumably because the compensation that they received from the local government, covered their costs, or because they were able to sell their vehicle quickly at no loss. However, we can see that, for most of the drivers here, they experienced pretty sizable losses. You can see here that 22% lost between 2.5 and 5,000 euros, and about 11% lost over 5,000, between 5,000 and 10,000 euros. Another 9% over 10,000 euros. So basically, people that had expensive cars either couldn't sell them or had to sell them for much, much cheaper. And that's, pretty significant sums here, okay? So I think, we're seeing here a case where we've got a policy that has quite a substantial effect on citizens overall. On average here, we're talking about 3,750 euros on average in terms of the hit that those drivers took as a result of the policy here, okay? Now, what are we going to be looking at? So people were hurt. We're going to be interested in how it affected, first of all, their vote. And we're going to be looking their vote for Lega in the European Parliament elections in May 2019. Now, why are we looking at those elections? Because those are the only elections that took place after the introduction of the Area B policy at the time we administered the survey. By that time, Area B was already announced for almost 1 year. And on top of that, we're going to be looking at other outcomes that are going to be will be the analysis of the probability of switching to Lega. So not only just on voting for Lega, but whether you switch to Lega, and we'll be using different baselines, whether you voted for Lega in the 2018 legislative elections, the regional elections, or in the municipal elections, okay? So we're going to have multiple baselines to do this analysis. And on top of that, we're going to be looking at a set of trying to get at the mechanisms here. So for that, we're going to be looking at how it affects set of attitudes and behavior on environmental issues. Okay, so now let's get at some results that we're getting. So first of all, we've got here the main regression table. And as I said, the main variable of interest here is on top, the interaction term here, basically being a diesel Euro 4 car owner. So those that were banned and that we're now comparing to the other 3 types of cars. We've got here the dummy variables for the diesel and the Euro 4. And ultimately here, you can see that in models 2 to 6, we're going to control for income, education, and age. And then in columns 4 to 6, we're also going to add the lagged vote for Lega in the previous elections. And in each of these models, we're going to use a different type of election as the baseline for legislature, 2018, regional elections, and the municipal elections. Let me show you the results in a graphical representation regarding this coefficient of interest, the top one. That's the main treatment effect that we're interested in. So you're going to see those 6 models now. And here you can see them graphically. And what we can see here from these 6 different regression models, now we're good. They're all just stacked vertically, and we're presenting only the coefficient for the treatment effect on vote for Lega. And what we can see is that the estimated effect on average is 13.5 percentage points. Now, considering the fact that support for Lega in Milan was just over almost 27.5%, those elections, this 13.5 percentage point difference is more than 55% above the baseline rate. So really big effects of this policy. Being hurt by this policy really drove the losers from the policy to vote for Lega. Really big effects, over 50% increase in the probability that they will vote for that. In the next analysis here, we're looking only at people that didn't vote for Lega before. Okay, we're going to subset the analysis only to those residents that didn't vote for Lega before. And we're going to be seeing whether being affected by the car ban is now associated with a larger probability of shifting to Lega in the 2019 elections. And as we can see here, that's exactly the case. So in the benchmark specification, so in columns 2, 5, and 8, we're seeing that the probability of switching to Lega jumps by over 15 percentage points, okay? 15.1 from the legislative election, 15.3 from the regional elections, and 18 percentage points for the municipal election, okay? So these are not just statistically significant, but also substantively very sizable effects here. And here I'm just showing you the same
about 5 more minutes.
Great. Here I'm showing you the same results. Basically, by sort of graphically, we can see the same effect that I've just shown you in the regression. Now, where did those votes come from? Here you can see on the left-hand side which parties they voted for before, on the right-hand side which parties they vote in the 2019 elections. So we're comparing who they voted in 2018 in the legislative elections to the 2019 European elections. And now let's focus just on Lega. And the interesting thing here is that we're seeing that most of the votes were obviously the ones that coming from people that did vote for Lega before, but the main transition here is not from people that voted for the left or for the incumbent party, but actually for those that were kind of on the fence and voted for the smaller other parties, okay? And that suggests that the response to the Area B policy was not a shift of disaffected left-wing voters that were now disillusioned, but rather kind of a coalescence of voters more on the fence who rallied in support of the party that was ultimately the most vocal opposition to the policy, okay? And we get very similar results when we look at regional or municipal elections. Okay, we also do a bunch of placebos just to show that this is really a convincing causal effect. We look, instead of the comparison that I showed you before, we do a comparison between Euro 5 and Euro 6, And here the expectation is that we won't find any effect. And indeed, when we look at the regression, we don't find any effect of the diesel times Euro 5. So that's exactly what we would expect. We also try and see what happens when we do an analysis, the same analysis that we did in terms of the car types, but now we're looking at the transition for elections before the policy was introduced. And again, we're finding no treatment effect for diesel Euro 4. So clearly, this evidence is strong, supporting indication that indeed this is the causal effect that we're suggesting. Now the question is, why did it happen? Is it because people now just became opposed to green agenda in general? Or were they were just disapproving of the policy approach specifically that the Social Democrats were advancing, and they just didn't like the pocketbook implications of this policy, so basically they voted for the party that was most opposed to this policy? And I think this is a really important question. When we introduce green policies, do we drive the losers against the green agenda in general, or do they just don't like the policy, specifically the one that is affecting them, and that their anger is focused on that? And so to get some indication of what's going on here, we banded together, collaborated with a company, an NGO called Zero CO2. That's a company that allows people to purchase trees to offset their carbon footprint. And specifically, as part of the study, we offered them the option, the people that were now taking our study, to do any of these following things. We introduced them to this company. They could read more about this company. They could click on the company's website, watch a video about it, follow it on social media, listen to its podcast, or to purchase a tree at 15% discount. And we were interested to see whether the people that were adversely affected by the Arabi policy were now less likely to do any of those things. Okay, so here you can see you've got the option of purchasing a tree. We gave them, through this collaboration, a discount on buying those trees. They could sign up to the podcast. They could do any of those things. And what we can see here, and that's the interesting finding, is that if anything, and now we're looking again at the same treatment effect on the people who were hurt by the policy, they were not less likely to click on the website, not less likely to watch the video. And if anything, they actually were slightly more likely to follow this company on social media, to sign up to its podcast, or to express interest in buying a tree. It's not actually buying a tree. Here they could just click and say that they were interested in buying a tree. When we actually followed their purchase, we couldn't see that they purchased more during the survey itself. Maybe they did it after, but not during the study. So clearly, there's no indication here that they became more antithetical to the global green agenda. We did the same thing on some local green initiative on Genitori Anti-Smog. That's a local initiative that's trying to reduce or encourage politicians to tackle air pollution locally in the Milan area, and to do certain educational programs on green initiatives locally. And again, we didn't find any evidence that those who were adversely affected by the car ban were less likely to be interested in this policy. If anything, they were slightly more interested in the newsletter and in donating to this NGO. Okay, so clearly, we don't find evidence for this first mechanism of people just turning against the green agenda generally or locally. When we look specifically at the second mechanism, namely, were they angry or responding to the distributional effects of the policy, here we see pretty clear evidence that those that were compensated by the policy weren't driven to Lega. Okay, so when we compare the electoral shift of those unaffected by the policy to those that were affected by the policy, but here we separate those that were treated and received partial compensation from the municipality as opposed to didn't, we see that the difference between the non-compensated and the compensated, we see that the effect is only among those that didn't receive compensation that were then more likely to vote for Lega. And I think that that's consistent with the view that incurring larger costs due to the policy was likely to spur a stronger shift to a Lega vote. Okay. Now, obviously, given that the application to receive compensation was not randomly assigned, we cannot ascertain that this differential electoral response actually represents a causal effect, but we think this is certainly in line with that. And we also see, we can ask ourselves, does it mean that any green policy that imposes costs would be opposed by those individuals? Here we see that the answer is negative. When we ask respondents whether they would be willing to support higher taxes to incur higher prices to pay an environmental policy, for an environmental policy, they were actually more supportive, only marginally so, but more supportive than those non-treated. So it seems that the issue for those car owners hurt by Area B wasn't anger at having to pay for an environmental initiative, but specifically that the policy approach that placed higher costs on them rather than spread it out on the broader public, that's what pissed them off and ultimately led to their response. Okay, so I'll skip this one. I'll just summarize here the main conclusion. What we saw here is that residents affected by Area B policy, car ban, were subsequently a lot more likely to vote for this right-wing populist party, the Lega. We see that the shift to Lega was not a result of left-leaning voters abandoning the party, but rather we see some kind of coalescence of voters that were not committed to the major parties before. Affected car owners did not become more hostile to environmental issues, neither globally nor to regional ones, but rather what we seem to see here is that residents seem to be responding to the perceived unfairness of the policy and the fact that it had adverse pocketbook implications. Final thought, in thinking about promoting green policies, I think we need to consider a few things. First of all, distribution of the costs across society, okay? Not surprising, but where possible, clearly policymakers should seek to spread the burden. Concentrated costs are a lot more likely to spread, to generate opposition. And so if we can spread those costs, that's the way to go about reducing potential opposition. The second thing is also a related one. Compensating the losers is likely to be key. Sizable constituencies are going to be hurt by the transition to green energy, so we need effective mechanisms to assist during that transition, okay? Only in the US, we're talking about 2.8 million people that are working in companies that extract or refine or distribute or produce electricity from fossil fuels. Now, if you think about the livelihood of those workers might be coming under threat if due to the green transition, without sufficient policies to place, to kind of compensate or cushion the blow, I think that the political backlash could be really substantial. And the last point, and I think it's an important one and not a trivial one, perhaps also a more contentious one. I think that if policymakers seek to make meaningful progress on central environmental goals, okay, I think that they should be really aware of these political trade-offs like the ones that we're seeing here that green policies entail. Some policies may offer a desirable environmental benefit, but if we find that those initiatives are triggering a political backlash that then puts in power leaders and parties that are opposed to the broader green agenda, I think that advancing these well-intentioned policies can ultimately prove detrimental to the broader cause of environmental protection. So we really need to think about which policies are worthwhile and which ones are ultimately going to drive a bigger cost to pay in the longer run, because we're bringing in or promoting the chances of anti-green politicians using this to gain power. So I'll stop here. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thanks, Yotam, for the excellent and very clear presentation. I'll now introduce our course panelists who read this paper very carefully as part of our course, and they'll lead the Q&A with me. In the first round of Q&A, we'll hear Yotam's response after each question. And I remind all participants, you're welcome to send to the co-hosts in the chat any questions you'd like to have considered for our second round of Q&A. So the first question comes from Matan Abdu, who is a third-year BA student in our department, and he also studies education. Matan.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Yotam, for this amazing lecture. Your research indicates that green policy will often hurt some citizens, like this case, and because of that will affect political parties. Are you aware of research that identifies other policy approach behind financial fines that could advance the green policy outcomes?
Thank you, Matan. Thanks for this question. So I think that the main dilemma that politicians have is whether to try and look to sanction people for polluting behavior, anti-green behavior, or whether to try and induce or provide incentives through subsidies and certain rewards for people that are actually promoting a green or adopting a green behavior, okay? So that's kind of the big dilemma that we've got here. any kind of Econ 101 course in environmental economics would suggest that we need the main thing that governments need to do in order to promote a more climate-friendly policy is to make sure that people that pollute or companies that pollute internalize the costs of the public bad, right? So the problem is that a manufacturing plant can pollute without necessarily incurring the costs of that to the planet, to society. And so part of what we think is the right thing to do is to make sure that we adapt taxation policies or sort of the types of taxes that companies or individuals pay in order to make sure that they internalize the costs of pollution. That is the standard approach. What we're seeing, and in part because of what I think are the implications of studies like the one that we've seen today, is that because there are political costs to sanctioning, politicians are thinking more and more about ways that they can ultimately encourage green behavior through subsidies and through incentives. And so, for instance, the idea of now we're seeing that the US under the Biden administration gave significant reductions for people that are buying electric cars. Yesterday, we saw Trump introducing an executive order to cancel that. That is an example of a policy that the Democrats tried to promote, and now that the Republicans are opposing. But those, I think, are the kind of policies that we could think, to your question, that governments could adopt. And we're seeing clearly in Europe that this is quite a popular approach.
Interesting addition to what we learned from the paper. Thanks, Yotam. Our next question is from Ilya Chaikin. He's a second-year BA student in our department who also studies geography.
Hello, Yotam. Thank you very much for the presentation. I was actually wondering if there is a way to implement green policies that doesn't have to go through the economic paradigm. If there is anything that we can do, maybe ideologically, maybe in the way that we change our tastes and our consumption, in the ways we consume, like electricity, in the way we consume products, is there any way to change, to escape beyond the economical thinking?
Thank you. So I think that this is a major area of research that people are now trying to figure out, particularly the idea of education and how do you communicate to people or educate people about the implications of their behavior and the implication of our behavior collectively on society, on the planet, on climate. And so the main non-economic approach is focused ultimately on how do we communicate in ways that people respond to it. So for instance, there are research, do we need to emphasize the threats? Do we need to emphasize actually what can be done? So there's some evidence that people, if you show them that basically the climate is going to be ruined, that it seems like too big of a challenge to deal with, so then people ultimately give up and don't even adopt smaller sort of behavior that can have effect at a smaller scale. So there really are issues in terms of how to communicate correctly to people what's at stake and what types of actions can ultimately help confront this challenge. And I think that this is something that we're learning more about, but I'd encourage you, if this is a question that interests you, I think there's a lot of interesting research to be done about that. I think that you're right in asking about what are the other ways that are not purely or only economic incentives or threats, sort of sanctions. And I think that this is an area that we should be focusing more on and learning more about. But as I said, this is the main direction that people are currently thinking about.
That's great to hear. That was something we were wondering about in class, if this was an upcoming line of research that our students could pursue as MA and PhD. So excellent. Our next question is from Ashana Ashaba, who is an MA student in our African Sustainable Communities program.
Thank you, Yotam, for the presentation. I loved the paper. So I would like to know how green policies can be marketed without causing a clash of political interests. In your experience as a senior fellow at the Israeli Democracy Institute, do you have any real-world experience on how to advance these types of policies despite resistance from populist parties?
Thank you. So I'll say this. I think that Jenny mentioned before that quite a bit of my research was about various aspects or the political aspects of globalization. And in globalization, there's a lot of questions, and this has also become a big issue around, again, if we look about American politics and what part of what Trump was pursuing, kind of an anti-free trade agenda. Now, if you think about the anti-free trade agenda, again, it's somewhat similar to what we're talking about in the paper today, that we've got a policy with clear distributive implications, we've got winners and losers, and then we've got the question of what do we do with the losers. I think that one of the insights that we have from research on trade, and that is some of the findings also from my own research, but also of others, that compensation can have some effect, some alleviating effects. I don't think it solves all the problems, but I think that thinking seriously about designing our policies in ways that would identify who the losers are and would do or makes real effort in terms of compensating their losses, that is a really big deal. Clearly, it wasn't done enough in the context of trade. So take both the Europe and the US. The US has a program called TAA, Trade Adjustment Assistance Program. That is the program that was designed to help the losers, and it's funded so poorly. And over years, its budget was cut and cut and cut, and people didn't really get the compensation, either in terms of pecuniary rewards or in terms of assistance in finding new jobs. And what we had is ultimately this kind of anger translating into electoral behavior, and that's a real problem. I think, and this is part of where I ended this talk now, is that I think it's a huge issue also in the US when thinking about the green transition. There are going to be some industries that are going to be massively affected by it, in some cases also very sort of in a negative fashion. And part of the problem, which is also correct in the case of trade and globalization, is that the losers tend to be also geographically concentrated. And so if you think about car manufacturers in the US, if now older cars or cars, fuel-driven cars, diesel-driven cars are going to be phased out, and some of these companies are going to be losing out to EV cars, electrical vehicles, we're going to have a lot of workers that are going to become unemployed. Same with all these other 3 million workers that I mentioned before, 2.8, in industries that rely on fuel extraction, whether in sort of different components. Those are big numbers, and not only are they big numbers, they're big numbers particularly because they're also concentrated in specific geographic regions that then can become a kind of pivotal voting constituencies. And so the real worry here is that once we have those grievances, and those grievances translate into voting, if we don't seriously think about how to compensate those voters in the way we design green policies, we're going to have real backlash and anti-green backlash. And so the worry here is, how do we avoid that? And I think that the fact that we have a president now coming into power in the US riding on this kind of anti-green agenda, that's a real worry. We saw them now announcing leaving the Paris Accords. You know, that has massive implications if the US is not part of that initiative. And so we really need to be thinking seriously about A, how to design those policies, and B, how to make compensation schemes and thinking about the losers as part of the way we design those policies.
Mm-hmm. This reminds me, we set the date of this webinar several weeks ago before the US election. So, and I was interested in hearing Yotam talk about other work he's done on populism or on democratic backsliding. It's a very timely moment today and this week to be talking exactly about the topics of this paper. Our last question in this first round of Q&A is from Amir Merli, who is a third-year BA student. He studies philosophy, and he also works at the Israeli Ministry for Environmental Protection, the Misrad Lahaganat Hasbiba. Amir.
Hey, first of all, thank you, Yotam, for the presentation. It really cleared more my understanding of the article. So my question is, have you considered whether non-financial compensations like public recognition, more access to alternative public transportation, or offering community benefits could help reduce community political backlash? How do you think these would work compared to financial compensations? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. I think we need to separate between two things. The ones that for people that are losing economically, I think we really need to think about economic compensation and assistance. And there, I don't really think that recognition or any type of those kind of alternative approaches would really solve the problem. But, and this goes also to the discussion that we had before and what Jenny just mentioned about the rise of populism. My own research, and I think that I've seen also research of others, indicates that economic implications of these policies, and that is true for all kind of globalization-related policies, are often not about economics. And I think that you've hinted it in your question, that sometimes they really are about issues of dignity, about the effects on the community, more generally, about a sense of being left behind, not only economically, but that society is moving forward and I'm not part of those benefiting from it, and that my community is not part of those benefiting from it. And those can be real source of resentment, and that those sources of resentment can later translate into this type of political response as the one that we've been discussing today and described in the paper. So what I do think, and this is another area that I'm really interested in, and anybody here that's interested in working on that, those are, I think, really worth thinking about, is really, and what does it mean to assist a community on those non-economic aspects? So not pecuniary, me, the government transferring to you 2,000 or 4,000 euros as Milan did for those people with banned cars, but if we have those communities that are adversely affected or that are being or have a sense of being left behind, what is the type of assistance that we can do on those cultural or non-purely economic dimensions that would strengthen people's sense of together, of not being shunned by the elites? And that is a really difficult question. I'm not sure I have good answers for it. And I think that this is really one of the more interesting and policy relevant questions that we need to be thinking about in the coming years. And so anybody that has ideas about that, I'll be happy to and curious to hear.
Okay, excellent. So we'll now proceed to our second round of Q&A. And we'll do this by asking questions one after the other. This includes questions that we brainstormed as a class and also other questions that have come in the chat. I also want to give a shout out here to Professor David Wettstein, who is a professor of economics at BGU and a former dean. It's great to have you here. I know you were interested for several weeks to join, so if you have questions, you're welcome to note. In the second round of Q&A, let's return first and hear our first question from Matan.
Yeah. How might the findings from Milan Area B policy apply to other regimes of countries with different political landscape and level of international policy support? For example, how will the effects be different in poor cities or rural areas in which people are more dependent on cars?
Okay. So I'll drop this question in the chat. For this round, we'll go sort of rapid fire, usual academic style. We'll drop the questions in your time, whatever you have time or interest to pick up on in your final comments, we'll be interested to hear. Let's hear next question from Ilya.
The European Union has a lot of green initiatives, including milestones for reducing emissions and encouraging public transportation. I was wondering, how do these initiatives impact a city like Milan and its local government when it comes to implementing it? Is the implementation process top down from the EU to the city, or is the city expected to initiate the policy changes themselves?
Great. Thanks, Ilya. Our next question in this round from Ashana.
Thank you. Oh, okay. Thank you so much. So the research design is very specific to a local context. We are curious to hear how you and your collaborators decided together on this specific topic compared to other contexts that could be studied. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. And last question in this round from Amir.
So my question is, did you look into whether explaining the environmental benefits more clearly or including the people affected in the policymaking process could help reduce backlash? Could transparency and inclusion serve as alternative or complementary strategies to compensations?
Okay, super easy questions to answer in 4 minutes, but Yotam, whatever you have the inspiration to answer, we're interested to hear.
So first of all, these are good questions, and I genuinely encourage you guys, if you have the inclination, the time, those are really good questions. And part of what I think about this paper is, was a first effort on my end to get into this area and to try and think about the implications of introducing those policies. But I think that there's a lot of big questions that are not answered in our paper, and I think that all these issues that you're now raising are really sort of important questions that we should try and go for, and try and think about ways to get at them empirically and give insights both to academics and and to policymakers. So first of all, I think the Matan's question about the variation, would we expect similar effects in areas that are poorer or in areas that are more rural, where people are even more dependent on cars? My sense is that we would see stronger effects there. We really saw that much of the language was directed to people who were dependent on that, and this idea that the rich elites don't really think about you, they're kind of disconnected from your concerns. I think that if we had a much bigger sample, we'd be able to kind of start doing analyses at kind of subset levels on trying to kind of identify really which kind of people are more susceptible to those types of issues. Our design is limited just because we don't have enough statistical power, but I think it's a very good question, and heterogeneity of these effects is a really important question. As to the second question, Ilya's question, I agree. So you asked me, how do these initiatives impact city like Milan and its local government, and when it comes to implementing it? And so here you're interested in the type of implementation. Here we had a case where the city itself and its voters decided upon it. So it's the case of this Beppe Sala, who's kind of a progressive, left-leaning mayor of Milan. He's the one that pushed for it. But then we see really this kind of tension between what the government is. Now we've got a right-wing, even a far-right government in Italy, and they are not pursuing the kind of policies that we're seeing some that are advanced at the locality or the municipal level. So for now, we're seeing this tension, and we saw the same thing now with the US. So again, the president, now Trump, very much opposed to the types of policies that some states, primarily California, are promoting. And so I think that this is where we're going to be seeing some of the interesting politics. Is it going to be something driven by the top, or in cases where the top goes in directions that are not supported by some lower level units, we're going to be seeing those policies advanced at kind of more local areas or local units. Ashana's question about the research design, you're saying it's specific to a local context, and you ask where we came from to think about it. So I don't know if you noticed, but all three of my collaborators are Italian. They all live in Milan. I had some ideas about environmental policy, and I spoke about it to Italo Colantone, my co-author, and he is one of those unfortunate owners of diesel Euro 4 cars, and he took quite a big hit, and he's an economist, and he was really annoyed at the fact that he took a big hit financially. And so then we started talking about it, and could the policy be designed differently, et cetera, et cetera. So the question in terms of interest was a broader one. The specific implementation or looking at Milan came from this conversation. And we thought that ultimately there was an interesting design here that would allow us kind of empirically to assess the causal effect in ways that are difficult in other contexts. Okay? And did our research explore whether providing clear communication about the environmental benefits of the policy would have an effect or reduce backlash? As I said, or sort of hinted before, we didn't look at it. I think it's a really important question. And I think that here people can do quite a bit of good work to try and get at that. And I have little insight from our own study, but I'd be curious to see our results from other papers.
Excellent. Thanks to Yotam and to our panelists and to all of our participants for asking such great questions. And this, our last webinar of the first semester of the series. We're excited to share, we already have a great lineup of speakers for second semester that we'll share with all. And we look forward to seeing you semester bet as well. Thanks to all, and looking forward to continuing this series.